With the contours of academic and life-oriented theology in mind, we should step back and make some preliminary evaluations. It helps to ask what advantages and disadvantages exist in each tendency. What are the positives and the negatives of an academic orientation and a life orientation in formal, serious theology? In the first place, the greatest strength of the academic approach is that it capitalizes on one of God's gracious gifts to humanity, our rational abilities. God has given human beings intellectual capacities, and He expects theologians to exercise those abilities in the pursuit of truth. Throughout the Scriptures, wise men are exalted for their intellectual skills as they use them in the fear of God. Pondering carefully the nature of truth and formulating beliefs out of those rational inquiries is an essential part of what it means to be wise. Solomon was wise because he exercised his ability to think through matters. Listen to the description of Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 4, verses 29 and 31. God gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight, and a breadth of understanding as measureless as the sand on the seashore. He was wiser than any other man. His fame spread to all the surrounding nations. In this vein, the wisdom literature of the Bible explicitly encourages us to develop and to use our reasoning abilities. In fact, the Apostle Peter praised Paul by acknowledging that his theology was intellectually sophisticated. As he said in 2 Peter chapter 3, verses 15 and 16, "Our dear brother Paul also wrote you with the wisdom that God gave him. His letters contain some things that are hard to understand." The intellectual or academic emphasis of traditional theology does not oppose the biblical notion of good theology. On the contrary, rigorous thinking is a great strength of traditional theology. Even so, we must equally stress that a danger lurks in the academic focus of theology. Unfortunately, it is often the case that traditional theology is so oriented toward conceptual or academic issues that theologians' lives outside the library receive very little attention. Arriving at true formulation of ideas easily becomes an end in itself, such that it's common for people to be considered good theologians simply because they know a lot about theological subjects. But at times, we have to admit, good theologians are not very good people. Sadly, this description applies to far too many reportedly good theologians. They can gather and collate facts about God and the Christian life with remarkable skill, but they fail to give the same level of attention to living in the light of the Christian faith. How do we get to the point where we believe someone can be a good theologian and not a good person? It's when we operate with a definition of theology that merely includes academic activities. When we think that doing theology means studying well, writing well, teaching true ideas. Unfortunately, this continues to be the tendency that undergirds most formal theological education today. The fact that theological seminaries rely almost exclusively on classroom experience to prepare ministers of the gospel reveals that we still believe that theology can be done in large measure apart from actually living theology. This is one of the greatest dangers in the traditional approach to formal theology. We should also realize that there are advantages and disadvantages with life-oriented theology. How should we assess this growing consensus that theology must be connected more directly with life outside of the study? In the first place, the greatest strength of this approach to theology is that it encourages us to observe some important biblical values. We all know passages such as James chapter 1, verse 22. There James wrote, "Do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourselves, do what it says." The intellectual hypocrisy of many theologians is utterly discounted by these words of Scripture. Good theology will lead to proper living, and not just proper learning. Isn't this what Paul meant when he told the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, "Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up." And again in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 2, "If I can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, but have not love, I am nothing." We really aren't fulfilling biblical standards if we only concentrate on learning about theology in some objective, conceptual way. Rather, theology that endorses the values of Scripture will be theology that fleshes out what we believe. At the same time, however, the life orientation in theology also poses a serious danger. It runs the risk of anti-intellectualism. Because many evangelicals today utterly distrust the intellectual side of theology, they turn against carefully studying theological doctrine. They actually view traditional academic-oriented formal theology as harmful to Christian living. We've all heard sincere people talk this way. I don't think we should get into doctrine. That will only take our minds off of Christ. Or maybe you've heard someone say this. You don't need to study theology to be a leader of the church. All you need is the leading of the Spirit. And as I just recently heard, intellectual Christianity is dead Christianity. These well-meaning believers have an obvious distaste for traditional, academically oriented theology. They reject it for an anti-intellectual approach to the faith. Instead of building their lives on carefully, even rigorously conceived theology, believers like these often simply lean on their own spiritual intuitions without carefully examining them. They may simply follow the lead of a powerful or charismatic leader, or they may substitute extraordinary spiritual experiences for traditional academic theology. Whatever the case, all of us should resist the serious danger of anti-intellectualism in the church because it will inevitably lead to false teachings and misconceptions of the Christian faith that will have dreadful ramifications for the lives of many believers. Paul recognized this danger when he warned Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, "Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a workman who does not need to be ashamed, who correctly handles the word of truth." Each of us must look carefully at the way we define theology. Some of us naturally tend toward an academically oriented view of theology to the neglect of other aspects of life. Others of us tend toward a life orientation to the neglect of intellectual matters. To avoid these extremes, we must acknowledge that there are dangers and values in both views. The way of wisdom is to embrace both outlooks at the same time. We need both theology for the academy and theology for life.